Before we get into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask that you subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out and it motivates me to make more content. Also, if you have any comments on the video or suggestions, then please leave them down below. Now, back to your regularly scheduled programming. Scipio Africanus is one of the most legendary Romans in history. His military prowess and accomplishments were, and even today still are, looked upon with amazement. In our last episode, we discussed his first campaign in Hispania, or modern-day Spain. We left off with Scipio solidifying Rome's hold over Hispania and kicking Carthage out of the peninsula. If you haven't watched that video, I would really suggest going and checking it out. It'll be linked in the upper right-hand corner of the video, and it will be the first link in the description. That video really sets the base for the rest of Scipio's life, and I think it is important to have that knowledge. We pick up then in 206 BCE. Scipio had taken Spain, and had fully solidified the hold Rome held over the peninsula. And yet, Scipio hungered for more. He was not content with just holding Spain. He wanted Africa, and most of all he wanted Carthage. And so, with those goals in mind, Scipio relinquished his command of the armies in Spain and returned to Rome. A year later, in 205 BCE, Scipio was unanimously elected consul at the age of 31, a decade younger than traditionally expected. But could you really blame the Romans? This man had just marched into a province on the edge of the known world where the Romans had suffered a near total defeat and in the space of 5 years had completely conquered the peninsula. He was already a hero, and no one was brave enough to question if he should be consul. However, with great success comes great envy, and Scipio would fall victim to the envy of the Roman Senate. Because of this, Scipio was not able to get command over enough soldiers to invade Africa. Instead, all he was given was the Sicilian garrison. Remember that at this point Hannibal was essentially trapped in southern Italy. Many in the Roman Senate wanted Scipio to focus all of his energy on Hannibal himself. However, Scipio believed that what was really needed was an attack on Carthage itself. He believed that Carthage would recall Hannibal as soon as the city itself was threatened. If they did that, Scipio would be presented with a golden opportunity. He could defeat Hannibal and then capture Carthage. Of course, this sounds so simple on paper, but at the time the situation was much more cloudy. Hannibal's army was still sizable enough to be a threat. It's really hard to tell exactly how many troops Hannibal had, as remember, the history was written by Romans, but it was likely somewhere between 5,000 men and 10,000 men. Still a serious threat. And for Rome itself, the populace and those in the Senate were beginning to suffer from serious war fatigue, and so Scipio faced an uphill battle in convincing them to approve an expedition to Carthage itself. Scipio, though, was not one to give in so easily. After realizing that the Senate had no intention of giving him his army, Scipio decided to make one for himself. Firstly, he had to look at the garrison he had just been given. At the time, the garrison in Sicily served as the place for punishment for dishonored soldiers. This meant that many of the men in Sicily had served in some of the most embarrassing defeats of Rome during the war, including the Battle of Cannae. Many Romans would have considered these men as losers and rejected their worth, but Scipio saw things differently. Remember, Scipio had fought at Cannae. He knew that the Roman defeat was not the fault of the average soldier. Scipio played to these men's desire to redeem themselves, and they formed the core of Scipio's new army. However, these men alone were not enough to take Carthage. Yet again, Scipio had an answer. He turned to Rome's people. As I've already pointed out, even by this point Scipio was a legend. He was the conqueror of Hispania, and had more success against Carthage than any other Roman in history. He was also handsome and eloquent, while still retaining his honor and just personality. He was an excellent orator, and so it should be no surprise that when Scipio spoke to the average Roman of inflicting a grievous injury on Carthage, an injury so bad that would win the war, they not only trusted him, but enthusiastically gave their support. And so, with the help of his position of power, his personality, and his allies and supporters, Scipio gathered a force of some 30 volunteer warships and 7,000 men. Now this was nowhere near enough troops to attack Carthage. This probably wasn't even enough troops to push Hannibal out of Italy. But what this proved was that Scipio was determined to do this one way or another. Eventually, the Roman Senate caught wind of what was happening down in Sicily and sent a commission to scope it out. What they found was Scipio at the head of a well-trained and well-equipped army. Scipio took this opportunity to press hard against the Senate. It seemed that even with the gathered army and fleet, that Scipio would not get his wish. That was until Scipio dropped his ultimate weapon. He told the Senate that they would either grant him a force and permission to invade Carthage, or he would appeal to the people for their support for his campaign. This turned the tide, and Scipio was granted permission to cross from Sicily to Africa if it appeared to be in Rome's interest. No bets on if Scipio thought that invasion would be in Rome's interest. With this newfound support, Scipio was able to put together a force of some 32,000 troops. Even with this massive increase in troop number, it was not enough to guarantee victory, and in fact, much of the Roman Senate thought that Scipio would fail. However, Scipio cared not for the opinions of those back in Rome. He wanted Carthage, and Scipio would get what he wanted one way or another. And so, in 204 BCE, Scipio and his army set sail for Utica, a city some 40 kilometers or 24 miles for all my fellow Americans away from Carthage itself. Scipio and his army besieged the city upon their landing, and despite the fact that the Romans were well supplied and had the morale advantage, the siege dragged on long enough that the Carthaginians were able to respond. First, an army of some 33,000 men, led by Hasdrubal Gisco, the same man who had lost to Scipio in Hispania, had set up camp about 11 kilometers or 7 miles from the main Roman encampment. Those forces were quickly joined by the Numidian forces, led by Syphax, who commanded roughly 60,000 troops. Yes, you heard that right, 60,000 troops. That would mean that Carthage had over 90,000 troops altogether. Unsurprisingly, you can see why modern historians have significant doubts about this number. Again, Roman historians are notorious for inflating numbers of Rome's enemies to make a Roman victory all the more impressive. In truth, Carthage likely had somewhere between 40 and 50,000 men. They certainly outnumbered Scipio and his army, especially in terms of cavalry. But the chances that Carthage had over 90,000 troops is about the same as me suddenly developing a six-pack. That is to say, none. Scipio was in a real bind here. He was outnumbered, and had so far been unable to take the city. He was reluctant to engage in an open battle, as he knew that being outnumbered was a hard disadvantage to overcome. But he was in luck. As you will remember if you watched the first part of this series, Hasdrubal Gisco, the general in charge of the Carthaginian army, had been defeated by Scipio back in Hispania. Because of this, Gisco was also reluctant to engage Scipio, as he knew that more troops were being recruited by Carthage and would soon join his army. So there was a stalemate. Scipio would take the first action by sending emissaries to Syphax, the Numidian king, in the hope of getting him to change sides. To begin with, these attempts were likely in good faith. However, it quickly became clear that Syphax was not interested in switching sides. He was only interested in acting as an intermediary to negotiate peace. Scipio was not interested in peace. Now we come to a part of the story that had a chance to completely derail Scipio's image, and at any point could have heavily backfired. Scipio decided to act like he was interested in peace, and attended several days of negotiations between the three groups. These negotiations took place at both the Carthaginian camp and the Numidian camp. Scipio had the extremely clever idea to send his junior officers in the disguises of slaves to these negotiations. These officers were able to take stock of the situation in both camps, and came to the conclusion that while the Carthaginian camp was solidly constructed, with well-defended entrances, the Numidian camp was made of mostly thatch and reeds, with no clearly defined entrances or perimeter. Scipio ran with this description, and had the officers note the size and composition of the Numidian army, along with mapping the routes used by the army to leave and enter the camp. Over the course of several days, Scipio's spies were able to map the camp out completely, and knew the routes and areas that would be well defended and occupied, and those that would not be. Scipio continued to draw negotiations out, telling Syphax and Gisco that while he was in agreement with the proposals, his senior officers were not. He projected a situation of, let's continue negotiating, and eventually I will convince my officers that this is for the best. But Scipio had no intention of signing any sort of peace agreement, and he was only extending the negotiations with the goal of gathering more and more military intelligence. This in and of itself was debatably dishonorable, or at least questionable for the time. But what Scipio did next was undoubtedly dishonorable and ethically questionable. Finally, In the spring of 203 BCE, Scipio announced to his troops that they would be storming the city of Utica. He began visible preparations to do such a thing. However, in private, he was simultaneously planning a night attack against the Numidians and the Carthaginians. He had no intention of storming the city. This was unquestionably a breach of popular etiquette, and would have been unthinkable to most Romans. However, Scipio was not most Romans. At around 9 or 10 at night, when most of the army on both sides would have been winding down for the night, Scipio began his assault on both of the camps. The Roman army was split into 3 forces. First, a strong contingent remained at the camp to ensure that no one would be able to take it, nor attack the rear of the other 2 contingents. Secondly, an army under the command of Gaius Laelius, Scipio's longtime second-in-command, set out for the Numidian camp. This army consisted of half of the attacking Romans, and the army, which was mostly cavalry, under the command of Massinissa, the Numidian king, who you will remember was related to one of the prisoners that Scipio had released back in Spain. And the last group was led by Scipio himself, and consisted of the remaining Roman forces. This army marched towards the Carthaginian camp. We don't know the exact number of forces involved in this battle. What we do know is that it was a slaughter in the favor of the Romans. The 2 armies arrived around the same time to both camps. Laelius attacked first. Their goal was to set fire to as many of the thatch and reed buildings that made up the Numidian camp as possible. This quickly caused the camp to devolve into chaos. Not only was the attack completely unexpected, but the fires disorientated the Numidians, with many believing the fires to have started accidentally. While many Numidians burned, others tried to run and were quickly killed by the Romans, who already knew what was going on, or were cut down by Massinissa's cavalry, which had set up a ring a little further away from the camp to ensure that as few Numidians as possible escaped. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian camp had quickly noticed the blazing fire in the Numidian camp, and many soldiers set off to help extinguish the blaze. Scipio had planned for this, and just as a contingent of Carthaginian soldiers set off to help their allies, his troops began their assault. The Romans cut down the men heading towards the Numidian camp, and then assaulted the main camp. They quickly lit the wooden Carthaginian buildings on fire, which spread among the cramped camp. Carthaginians rushed out into the otherwise pitch-black camp without their weapons or armor, with the goal of fleeing the blaze. They were quickly cut down and decimated by the well-prepared Romans. Polybius writes that Hasdrubal managed to flee with some 2,500 men, while Syphax escaped with only a few cavalry. He further writes that the combined Carthaginians and Numidians lost between 30,000 and 40,000 men. Of course, these numbers are likely exaggerated, and the number was likely much less. But whatever the case, by noon the next day, the Carthaginian and Numidian armies were both in complete retreat, with likely tens of thousands dead. Hasdrubal would flee with whatever Carthaginians that remained back to Carthage itself, while Syphax would retreat with the Numidians to Adda, a town roughly 7 miles away. The Romans would quickly sack 2 Carthaginian towns to regain some supplies before withdrawing back to their siege of Utica. Rome and Scipio had undoubtedly secured a major victory. The victory, however, presented an ethical conundrum. Yes, Scipio had won, but it was tainted by his actions prior to the battle. An ambush was fair game, but to attack when you were, at least officially, discussing peace? For most Romans, that would have been a step too far. In the end, however, Scipio would go on to win the war, and Roman historians and writers from the period would write away the event with excuses and attempt to explain away the issue entirely. And the efforts would work. Yes, some would grumble that the victory was undeserved, and that Scipio should be tainted by the event, but his total victory over Carthage later in the story would overcome all of this. However, I do think this is an important point in the wider study of history. Our history relies on what has been written and recorded. Would our view of Scipio have changed if he had been painted as a dishonorable coward? Would contemporary sources have portrayed him as such if he had ultimately lost the war? In the end, we can't answer these questions with any certainty, but it does teach us a lesson. That lesson being that history is not black and white, just as human beings are not black and white. And it is important that when studying history, we acknowledge that even great people can do terrible things. Syphax and Hasdrubal would quickly attempt to recover, and would succeed in gathering a force of some 30,000 men. The 2 armies would again meet at the Battle of the Great Plains, or the Battle of the Bagradas River. Eventually, the two would agree to a pitched battle. However, Hasdrubal had severely underestimated the effect that the massacre at Utica had on his men's morale. Those who had survived either quickly broke up on contact, or just turned and fled long before it. This set off a domino effect among the quickly raised recruits, who had no real training, and they in turn fled or surrendered as well. In fact, the only group in the Carthaginian army who did attempt to really fight were the group of Iberian mercenaries that had arrived shortly after the disaster at Utica. However, these men would be enveloped and slain to the last. Hasdrubal and Syphax had been defeated once again. Hasdrubal returned to Carthage in shame and was demoted and exiled, never quite being able to get one over on Scipio, while Syphax would retreat back to his capital of Cirta, where he would again be defeated, and this time captured by Massinissa and Gaius Laelius. Massinissa would take over Syphax's kingdom, while Syphax himself would be shipped back to Rome as a sort of trophy. Scipio and Carthage now entered into serious peace negotiations, with a draft proposal even being ratified by the Roman Senate. But because of Carthage's mistrust towards the Romans, surely the debacle at Utica did not help things. Along with Carthage recalling Hannibal back to Carthage, the Carthaginian Senate would refuse the treaty, and the war would continue. Hannibal would be given command of an army of his own veterans, along with newly raised troops from Africa, and Scipio would hurry to give battle, as he was concerned that his political opponents back in Rome might try to replace him, or force through some sort of peace. I do have to apologize here. This video is already getting kind of long, so we will leave it on that cliffhanger. Join me next time when we will examine the final stage of the Second Punic War, and the famous Battle of Zama, as well as what became of Scipio after his final victory. Thank you for watching. I hope you really enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. If you have any comments on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. I do want to take a moment to really thank all of you that have watched so far. My JFK video is about to pass 100 views, which is just insane to me. I know it doesn't seem like much compared to other YouTubers, but just the fact that 100 people will listen to me ramble about history is incredible to me. So really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Peace.